Somalia currently faces a serious threat from Ethiopia's recent actions, which flagrantly violate our territorial integrity, and Ethiopia must be held accountable for actions that threaten to destabilize the Horn of Africa.
There is a diplomatic row between Ethiopia and Somalia regarding the deal that Ethiopia made with Somaliland earlier this year. And that diplomatic row showed up in the UNGA, the 79th UNGA in New York. Well, the Prime Minister of Somalia, Hamza Abdi Barre, gave his speech, and in between his speech, he slammed Ethiopia for making a deal with Somaliland. In fact, he said that the deal is violating the sovereignty of Somalia, and further that it is encouraging secessionists in Somalia to make their own country called Somaliland. Well, on 1st January 2024, a memorandum of understanding was signed between Ethiopia Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Somaliland President Muse Bihi Abdi. Reportedly, this MOU stated that Somaliland will lease 19 kilometers, that is akin to 12 miles, of Gulf of Aden coastline to Ethiopia around the port city of Berbera. Now, that deal between Ethiopia and Somaliland is the one that has brought a lot of diplomatic issues. In fact, Somalia expelled the Ethiopian ambassador from its country. That just tells you the extent of the diplomatic issues that now Somalia has with Ethiopia. Well, Somaliland is a self-governing region north of Somalia. It is the region that is bordering Djibouti and also bordering Ethiopia. For quite some time, Ethiopia has wanted to have a seaport. We know that Ethiopia and Eritrea were once one country, but after Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia, Ethiopia was left without coastal access. And that meant that Ethiopia became landlocked and it had to make deals with neighboring countries so that it can access the sea because of course any country would like access to the sea so that they can do trade easily. So that meant that Ethiopia had to make deals with countries around. That means Djibouti, Somalia, and Kenya. Kenya has given access to Ethiopia through the Lamu port, and that is the Lamu corridor. The project is still ongoing, but still there are goods that can be ferried from Kenya all the way to Ethiopia. Ethiopia is also in close relations with Djibouti and uses the Djiboutian port quite oftenly, but Ethiopia doesn't have its own controlled port, which will make it much easier and much cheaper to transport anything that it wanted. Further, a coastal line will guarantee Ethiopia a naval base, and that is part of the reason as to why Somalia became a little bit agitated, because in the deal, Ethiopia was not only going to have a port for commercial services, it was also going to have a naval base in Somaliland. So Somalia saw this as an altercation or disrespect to the Somalian government, because for the longest time, Somalia has claimed that the entire region is Somalia, because Somaliland is not recognized by the UN, it is not even recognized by the AU. So that means it is still considered part of Somalia in international terms. So when Ethiopia went ahead to make a deal with Somalia, then the Somalian government saw it as a provocation. And they're saying that this deal is also making other people to view Somalia differently. And that is the reason as to why Somalia had to now link up with Egypt. And where does Egypt come in? Because of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. While Ethiopia is developing the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Egypt doesn't want all this water to be withheld, because the Nile is the lifeline of Egypt, the literal lifeline of Egypt. So if the Nile is reduced, or if the waters of the Nile reduce, that means that there will be a lot of repercussions downstream. And by downstream, we mean Egypt, because Egypt uses the River Nile for everything. Literally, the entire economy of Egypt is pegged on two things: the River Nile and the Suez Canal. So if the River Nile is choked from its sources, because there are two tributaries of River Nile. There is the Blue Nile and there is the White Nile. Now, Ethiopia controls the Blue Nile. All the sources of the Blue Nile are coming from the highlands of Ethiopia, and they are draining all the way to Sudan, then all the way to Egypt and drain to the Mediterranean Sea. Now that is a bone of contention because the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is a project. In fact, it is the largest dam that will have been built in Africa. And the Ethiopian government wants to finish this dam in a very short time, in about 5 years or less than 10 years. And that is the bone of contention with Egypt. Egypt says, we don't have a problem with you having a dam. The problem is the time that you're going to use to fill up this dam. If you want this ambitious project to happen before 10 years, then it means that you're going to choke a lot of water from the Blue Nile, and that means that downstream we're not going to have enough water to sustain lives in Egypt. So the argument that Egypt gives is that use more time, use more than 10 years to slowly fill up this dam so that we can also have water downstream. But Ethiopia says, this is our project, this is our land. You cannot dictate anything that will happen in our land. And this is our water, this is coming from our sources, this is our project. Millions of Ethiopians still don't have electricity, and we intend to give them electricity as soon as possible. Ethiopia also intends to export that electricity to neighboring countries so that it can earn revenue. So that is the bone of contention that now brought the two countries, Somalia and Egypt, together. And Somalia and Egypt are working together in terms of security. Recently, Egypt has committed to give Somalia security in terms of them fighting the insurgencies that are happening in the country. And Egypt has delivered arms twice now to Somalia, and that is angering Ethiopia. And furthermore, Somalia released a statement and said that it doesn't want Ethiopian soldiers in its territory because Ethiopian soldiers are in Somalia to help as part of ATMIS, that is the African Union transition mission in Somalia, to transition to another mission from AMISOM, that is the part of the AU mission that is in Somalia to quell down the insurgencies that have been happening in the country. So Somalia is saying that we don't need any further assistance from Ethiopia, and that Ethiopian soldiers should go back beyond the borders of Somalia, and they are welcoming Egyptians to come into their country. Now, because Egypt and Somalia are not in good terms, Ethiopia is seeing this as a threat, because this now means that Egyptian soldiers will be at the border of Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia and Egypt do not share any border. What they only share are the waters of River Nile, because Ethiopia borders Sudan, So what happens is that now with this rearrangement, because we're going to have a different mission in Somalia. ATMIS has finished its mission and the AU introduced AWSOM. Now with AWSOM, Egypt has pledged to be part of the mission and has already pledged security forces and equipment to Somalia. They are going to deploy their armed forces to help Somalia counter the insurgencies that are happening. And that is deemed to be a problem with Ethiopia. Ethiopia is seeing this as a threat, as a double threat from Somalia and from Egypt because of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that is bringing a row with Egypt, and the fact that Ethiopia made a deal with Somaliland to have that portion of land at the coast that will have commercial and naval base. So that is what is bringing all these diplomatic issues that are happening and that expose themselves at the UNGA between Ethiopia, Somalia, and Egypt.